Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Tonight, again, for an update with our friend and colleague, Pietro Shakarian. Pietro, welcome back.
Pascal, great to be here. Pleasure as always.
And just to start directly with the topic, I mean, we want to go through Iran and Armenia to Russia a little bit, so from south to north. And you are, of course, you're from Armenia, you're from the region, the Southern Caucasus. You've also had a lot of experience in the United States and in Russia as well as an academic. Let's begin with Iran. Where are we today? We've just had this huge funeral that actually coincided more or less with the 4th of July celebrations in the United States. Is that a coincidence? And how did you perceive that funeral going?
Well, that funeral was, from what I understand, absolutely extraordinary. I mean, many international guests attended to mark the passing of Ali Khamenei. His death, his assassination. But really, what it underscored to me is, number one, that Iran is not an isolated country by any means, and number two, it also emphasized how the United States is in a bind with this outcome of this Iran war. There was never this belief that Iran could actually, challenge the U.S. in such a way as this. But as I alluded, I think on one of our earlier podcasts, you were asking me, what can Iran do? And I said one of the things that they can do would be to kind of close the Straits of Hormuz, or kind of take control over it, and control who goes in, who goes out, and all this. And what they did was they completely, brilliantly, flipped the whole narrative of the international politics. And what it did was, in retrospect, it was a very risky gambit of the United States to think that they could actually challenge Iran in such a way as this, because Iran completely, flipped the script. I mean, that the United States, in the end, I mean, it revealed the weaknesses of the United States. And as a superpower on the international stage, that's not something, you want to have happen to you. But in the case of Iran, this is what occurred. So yeah, so the funeral of Ali Khamenei. Now, of course, we also had Trump's threats. He was here. I mean, this is really obscene to do this in terms of a funeral of a state leader. But Trump has shown that he has no boundaries, and he's willing to do or say anything like this. But at the end of the day, what can the United States do? I mean, they're in a bind, and there is this other element of this so-called deal that we have on the table, that the United States is trying to kind of forge with Iran, with the mediation of the Pakistanis and the Qataris. And so the question becomes now, what happens? Will this deal be fully implemented? And there's a lot of question about that, because one of the big elements of this deal is this idea of Lebanon. And Israel, as we know, is not being, rather, it's not being very constructive, to put it very, very, very mildly, in Lebanon. So that's kind of where we are right now, just to give you the general overview.
Let me just ask you, because this one puzzled me a little bit when I realized that it's going on, which is like, the negotiation started in Pakistan. They signed or did parts of the MOU in Switzerland, and okay, this is understandable, but that now Qatar is involved in that, not Oman. And because Qatar is one of the states that actually got hammered during this entire affair, how do you interpret that part of the negotiations are now done in Qatar, which actually, at the very beginning cried foul very badly and said, like, oh, unprovoked attack against us, which, people like us, we immediately dismiss, because of course the US airbase and everything, and using Qatari's space in ground and airspace in order to attack Iran, right? But what's your interpretation on Qatar?
I think that, a lot of these, GCC states, Pascal, have understood that having the U.S. presence there does not help them. It makes them a target, right? And by the way, the countries in the Baltic region should be getting the memo on that. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right? In the context of Russia and the U.S., right? But in this case, as we're talking about, the Gulf, increasingly you're seeing kind of a pushback of, certain countries there against against the U.S. Effectively at the end of the day. And I mean, of course, you have UAE, which is rather the outlier, but then you're seeing Qatar, you're seeing Saudi. Saudi was at the funeral. Okay, that tells you something right there. It tells you something about the changing dynamics. I mean, this whole Hormuz affair has is really a vivid illustration of the fact that we're now in a multipolar world. It's a vivid
Mhm.
illustration of the multipolarity that we're now in, the multipolar moment. Um,
Mhm.
and the great irony is Trump put the U.S. in that position, I guess, believing somehow that this move would not only would it be in defense of Israel, as we know, Netanyahu played a very substantial role in convincing Trump to go to war, but also that maybe it was connected with this idea that, the US could still kind of show its mettle. We could do regime change on the cheap from the air with no ground power, right? We're that good. And in the end, it didn't work out that way. And so it's become a vivid illustration, I think, of multipolarity in action.
The Iranians are actually quite brilliant about this, right? Because the idea of the Americans was to have millions of people in the streets in order to overthrow the regime, right? And now they have millions of people in the on the streets in order to mark the funeral of Ali Khamenei, of the incarnation basically of the regime, right? So
Yeah.
they're also really good at using this as a way to message to everybody else. I mean, the biggest surprise to me is that it is the Iranians that actually managed to break through also in the information space of the West
Oh,
with the Lego
absolutely.
movies, with the
Absolutely.
with the memes, with the Twitter that they do. Now with this one, this is a huge break actually, just to hammer a bit of information down the throat of the West, isn't it?
Absolutely, because again, one of the main theses that they were advancing was that the regime is so unpopular, the Islamic Republic is so unpopular, and in the end, now we see it's rather the opposite. In fact, it created a rallying around the flag effect. You would even have people, I mean, from what I've heard on the ground in Tehran, you would actually have people who were former critics of the regime, even there in attendance at the funeral. So it's quite extraordinary. But you mentioned about the Lego movies. It just came out with one today, actually, about the whole FIFA controversy with the red card, as we know from the U.S. Bosnia game. I mean, this was a big deal, and then that was followed by yesterday. You saw. 4-1, Belgium, clobbered the U.S. team. So it was like karma came back.
Hey, just a very quick note. The best way to support this channel is by signing up for my free Substack. You can also help with a paid subscription there, or you can get some of our new merch on neutralitystudies.com. Links below. See you there.
But this also follows, Pascal, what happened during this World Cup, right? I mean, it goes beyond just, the whole issue of the red card, Trump calling up Gianni and saying, hey, look, I want you to fix this for me, FIFA, that kind of a thing. But it also, also the whole discrimination, really, the treatment, the unfair treatment of the Iranian team. Yeah, was just disgraceful in this World Cup. That needs to be that needs to be absolutely highlighted in this. But no matter what Trump did, I mean, no matter what restrictions were placed on the Iranian team, no matter that Trump tried to intervene, which is insane, politically intervene in a football match. That even despite all that, you see where the tide is, where things are going.
Let's discuss this just a little bit because I think it's a very very interesting micro thing in the larger macro perspective. I mean, I told you just before we started, right, that to me this whole affair with FIFA is a perfect example of the rules based international order, right? For the West making the rules, ordering everybody else to follow, but whenever they don't want to follow, they just call up Giuliani and tell them that a red card is
Absolutely.
not a red card anymore. By the way,
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, where the idea is, you know what? We make the rules, you follow the orders, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's how this whole thing goes. And
yeah.
it should not be, by the way, conflated with international law. It's
No,
it's just quite the opposite of that.
it's the opposite.
And actually, that's the other thing too. Iran, that whole war was the greatest violation of international law.
Mhm.
And so, yeah,
There's more things that are really interesting about this. I mean, you have also this moment of the immediate the people who are immediately threatened by Iran, the Gulf states and so on, actually sending delegations to the funeral of Khamenei, while the United States threatens an attack during that funeral, while the United States actually does everything under the sun in order to kick out the Iranians and be unfair to them, to be unfair to everybody. But you see how the whole rest of the world is already starting to develop a different mode of engagement. I mean, the Saudis obviously are not in love with the Iranians, obviously not. But when it comes to funerals and to this kind of state to state interaction, they already moved on from the Western paradigm of, the other one is Hitler, and when Hitler dies, everybody goes yay and celebrates and in the streets with little flags. They do the opposite of that.
Well, and also that really, to me, it tells me, Pascal, to be quite honest, about the shortcomings of American intelligence. Because if they really believe that the government of Iran was that top heavy, that everything depended on the one man, Mr. Khamenei, and that there was not this complex system of the Islamic Republic in place, which is very sophisticated, with all sorts of checks and balances and everything like this, it tells me that the intel wasn't very good. Although, as far as also I know, that those voices who were trying to persuade Trump not to go to war, that this is going to be a disaster for the U.S., that they were silenced, that Trump sidelined them because they were, politically inconvenient for his, belief that he could do this. And I think he was, again, kind of going off the high of Venezuela, although they're two completely different scenarios. I don't know how we could, think that that's similar. And also, by the way, Latin America, we're not done with that, because we still have the issue of Cuba. Mr. Rubio has access to grinds, right, which he's using the weight of the American foreign policy to kind of do that, right? And also, by the way, it's interesting because even domestically now, speaking of which, because when we talk about Cuba and the legacies of Mr. Castro and all that, and communism in Cuba, now Trump is trying to hit out at so-called communists in the U.S., right? He's trying to kind of play the McCarthy card. And
But it's so dumb. This is so dumb. I mean, he could do this well.
Going to fall for it. And
I mean, the next
part of this problem is he's facing a reaction on his hands. I mean, his donors. I mean, we're talking about the Israeli lobby. They're facing a huge backlash in New York City, and he's blaming the DSA, calling them communists. So we're not. I think it's a desperate move, and it sounds ridiculous.
I mean, like, this is so dumb that when I heard him say that, I was like, what's next? I mean, probably in August, he's going to travel to Salem and do a rally against witches. It's like, we must oppose the witches. He seems to be like, even like historically confused about the times we're in.
I don't think he's going to do well in the midterms, to be honest with you, in the United States. I mean, I can just say this right now. Right now, I'm in the United States, and people are not too happy with his performance, quote unquote, as president. And especially when people reflect on the 250th anniversary of the United States, and they look back, and we have even, you look back at the history, Pascal, you look at George Washington, who warned against entangling alliances. He warned against the United States getting involved in these overseas adventures. Also, John Quincy Adams, too, and the founding fathers, could foresee the disaster that America is in now, and they were saying, no, we should avoid that. But apparently, nobody listened to them. I mean,
there's a beautiful essay out there by Christopher Mott who did a very good comparison between these two hearts in the chest of the United States. You always had the Washingtonians and Quincy people, but at the same time you had the Jeffersonians that wanted to go there, and well, the Jeffersons had it, but for how long? I do wonder. And maybe last topic in this part of Iran, or before we move to Armenia, like, what do you think about the MOU? How long is its half-life time?
Well, the biggest problem with the MOU is that the United States, first of all, it needs the MOU. Why does it need the MOU? Because it needs to have Hormuz opened, right? But the problem is, and this is where you can maybe say the Iranians, I mean, you can say the Iranians play their cards brilliantly to perfection. That by including Lebanon, it makes the enforcement of this deal very, very difficult because of the Israeli factor. Israel is, kind of just like on the loose, attacking, invading southern Lebanon, taking swaths of
Mhm.
territory, doing ethnic cleansing in southern Lebanon, to say nothing of the genocide in Gaza, which is still ongoing. Um, and I think uh, that's the big challenge of this. And it's going to challenge, above all, it's going to test, I think, the U.S. Israeli relationship, because at the end of the day, the United States understands at some level that they can't keep this confrontation up with Iran forever. That the Straits of Hormuz, and they can't open that up by force. There is some talk about the United States maybe doing a potential ground invasion of Iran from Iraq, but that would be massively bloody and massively catastrophic. First and foremost for the United States, and it would be a war that they could never win. They could
Chess
never
Free
win.
Chess Freeman on my channel actually once put it this way, for a ground invasion, the Iranians are like the spider in the web, saying like, "Yes, come here, little fly, come to me."
Absolutely.
It's like,
Well,
because it seems like there were so many dumb decisions that actually that one would line up. And the other thing about the MOU, I think in my view, the MOU to the Iranians also serves as a measuring tape, as like, are you living up to this or not? Are you living up to it or not? Because there's a lot of verifiable aspects in there that the Iranians can always point at and say like, well, you haven't reached it yet, therefore not moving forward, or therefore closing the Strait of Hormuz again. It's like, it's actually quite a scientific approach at
oh yeah, absolutely.
negotiations.
Very methodical, and also you have to think this is quite extraordinary that
Yeah.
again, who came out on top? Now it's very, if I wouldn't be able to say this on corporate media, but in fact Iran won the war
Yeah, of course.
because they're the ones who are lining up the terms here of this MOU, of this so-called deal. It's, by the way, it's interesting that Trump calls this a deal, right? Which also tells you a lot about his hyper-transactional approach, his kind of, I guess, his belief, and this kind of actually comes from Patrick Henningsen. He talks a lot about these ideas on various podcasts, but this idea that he doesn't want this really codified as a treaty, because Trump wants to, I mean, if he wants to like leave it, or he wants to violate, or change the terms of it, he can. If it's a deal, then it's kind of amorphous. It's not really so hard and fast as a treaty or something like that. But on the other hand, what can he really do, Pascal? That's the big question. What can he really do? He really can't do much, and that's the reality.
No, and the Iranians figured out. I mean, the U.S. is willing to break even the Charter of the United Nations, right?
Oh,
There's no bigger
absolutely.
treaty than that one. So you cannot make him sign anything that he could just break. So it needs to have real hurt. If he breaks it, there must be real hurt. Therefore, he will think twice about it. And
Absolutely.
they've established that with Hormuz. So this, but
Um,
let's go to Armenia actually, and the southern Caucasus, because that area is now also very, very contested again, because geography. And we've just seen in Armenia the elections, and you've hooked me up with a couple of your colleagues, and everybody is quite in that corner, is actually quite outraged at what happened. But what's the situation now in July?
well, the situation now in July is that, I mean, obviously, the assessment, the feeling among the population is that the election was completely rigged. Right now, Pashinyan had won elections before, but you could say they were more, fair, on the up and up. But this one was clearly a rigged election, completely, in all senses. My colleagues can kind of, I mean, they've already spoken to you about the nitty gritty of all that. On the other hand, though, the opposition did not have a plan B. They were not yet fully consolidated. And so this created kind of a split approach to what we do next. There really was not this idea that, are we going to do, street protests? Are we going to, challenge this legally? And that's also a big issue, because they try to challenge it legally. If they go to the Central Election Commission, it's run by a Pashinyan ally. and so the question is, how much can you really change? And so, and Pashinyan, meanwhile, has become more oppressive in the aftermath of this election, even less democratic. He feels that, the wind is to his back in terms of support from the European Union, which is really interesting because the European Union is always talking about supporting democracy. And in this case, we can see that they are facilitating the rise of autocracy. I mean, really, they are. There's no other way to put it. That's what's happening right now in Armenia. Today, Gagik Sarukyan, basically, he was leader of this party, Prosperous Armenia, that, as my colleagues told you, um, was on the threshold of getting into parliament or being excluded from parliament, right? It could have been easily 4%. It was like, was that 4% in some of the results that were coming in, all the near to final results put them at 4%, and then suddenly the Central Election Commission changed that to 3.99996, something like that. And so on that metric, they excluded them from parliament, which is really questionable, really in terms of legality, certainly. And what ended up happening is now they've gone completely after him. They've confiscated his property. They've arrested him. This guy was extraordinarily rich, Armenian, guy. He was a former sportsman who was residing in this Kotaik region of Armenia. And even though, some people would criticize him, say, oh, the guy's an oligarch and all this and that. And nevertheless, for his local people there in Kotaik, he invested a lot in the local economy. So a lot of people there in that region of Armenia really like him and all this. And the guy even had his own private zoo with a lion. And what happened is when the government now was confiscating everything, they sedated the lion. And unfortunately, they ended up killing the lion, or the lion ended up dying while they were trying to take her away. The lioness, I should say. So that's kind of the dynamic of what's going on right now. It's a much more repressive environment in Armenia, unfortunately. It pains me to say that, but that's where we are. And the other thing also that's really quite interesting about this is how the European Union approach to the whole situation, Pascal, is all based on making this a Russia versus West issue. They like to say that, the Russians were interfering in the Armenian election, right? Which really was not the case, but that's what they say, that the Russians were interfering in the Armenian election. And moreover, that this is that we saved the day and we saved democracy in Armenia by supporting Nikol Pashinyan and retaining the power. But in reality, there's another hidden chapter of this, a hidden dimension, which is the element of Iran. And even though we saw Nikol Pashinyan, for example, going to the funeral of Ali Khamenei, nevertheless, Armenia's actions have, you know, very much angered Iran in terms of, their support for this Trump corridor. This idea of, kind of creating a long-standing U.S. presence on the border between Armenia and Iran, also helping to facilitate, Turkey and Azerbaijan's, hyper-nationalistic pan-Turkist, fantasies and all this and that. And so Iran is not very happy about this. And that whole dimension was missing from the EU narrative, conveniently. So it was almost as if they were using Russophobia as the cover to distract away from the attention of what a Pashinyan election could mean for Iran. So that was another interesting element of this.
I- isn't Armenia getting, I mean, closer and closer to an extremely dangerous situation? Because I mean, let's just you mentioned a lot, but on top of everything, like the Pashinyan is also the guy who arrested a part of the religious leadership of Armenia, of the Christian leadership, right? And put even priests in prison, who's putting other opposition parties into prison, and criticizing the opposition parties for not uniting. Maybe fair enough. On the other hand, they were actively being persecuted, right? By Pashinyan while trying to run in elections, and now after the elections, there's even more crackdown, and the 4% that you mentioned, this tiny party, excluding them is even more important, because it means the redistribution of seat gives now Pashinyan's party a absolute majority in parliament, doesn't it? If I
Well,
understood it correctly.
it gives him a majority, but not as a majority that would enable him, let's say, to amend the Constitution, because that's the big kahuna, to kind of
No,
do
sorry,
whatever he wants.
sorry, a simple majority, not absolute majority. A simple majority, but the
Yeah.
simple majority is actually what he will need in order to get the trip corridor ratified, isn't it? If he signs a treaty with Trump and then puts it to Parliament, that would suffice to actually ratify it and then make it a 99-year deal and give them that entire strip of land.
Well, we shall see in terms of how that is implemented. I don't think he can do that necessarily fully at this point. He can appoint a government. He can create a government. He can run, the government. He can do the day-to-day things, but it's not clear if he could actually, he couldn't. I don't think he could not pass without significant opposition. Let's say this trip deal. So that he is quite limited. He didn't get 50%. He got like 49.5% or something like that.
I thought the 4% or the fact that he could exclude them pushes him above 50. No?
No, I have to double check on this, but I don't think it was just, this is a minor detail, but he still, even if so if you just look at it, taking the percentages, I mean, he basically kind of, he has a simple majority, but not the majority that he really needs to amend the Constitution. That's the big thing, right? So he's still a little bit limited in what he can do, but he still is there, and that's the big issue. As long as he's there, he still is going to cause problems. And really, the people in Armenia, I can say this: my impression is, and the aftermath of this, because they rigged the election so brazenly, he actually became less popular as a result of this election campaign and this execution of the election. So that's actually quite interesting, that even though he technically, I mean, by their results, he won, the people, by and large, you get the sense, they view him even more negatively than they did before. So it's going to be quite interesting to see how the situation goes, moves forward. And I think that actually people, there is a very, very high political tension right now in Armenia over this situation. So yeah.
Yeah, what was kind of infuriating yet very much on script is then the duplicity and the hypocrisy of the European Union trying to pretend that he's a great democratic liberator when, for all objective metrics, I mean, this is sliding into authoritarianism in Armenia. But
Just recently, I think it was just yesterday, actually, Marta Kos, who was the commissioner for EU enlargement, she made a Facebook post saying, look, when I was in Armenia, she was in Armenia recently, I picked up all these apricots and I made apricot jam, and isn't that wonderful? And you know what? We were there helping the Armenians save their democracy against the dastardly Russians, and so on and so forth. But in truth, again, like I said, we have their real number. We know what they were really doing. They really were covering for, this trip corridor, for which also is an extension of Trump's aggressive designs on Iran, right? So the EU, I mean, they're not fooling anybody. They try to frame this as exclusively Russia-U.S. conflict over the Caucasus. It's very, very, clever. But in truth, they're acting as cover for Trump's neocon designs and his war on Iran. That's really what we're seeing.
yeah, it just leaves me wonder where this is going, because I think like Armenia, Azerbaijan of the three is the one that is hardest to cover for me, because it seems like a kind of separate case. But Armenia and Georgia are in such comparable positions, and one of them, Georgia, is moving very much in the direction of trying to maintain as much freedom of action as they can. Some of them even talking about active neutrality for Georgia, while Armenia seems to be going in, like, throw everything it has into the lot of the West at the moment when the West actually is at its deepest crisis in basically 500 years. And it just makes me worry about Armenia, them being sandwiched between Azerbaijan and Turkey. And we know that both of them are not very friendly toward the entire project of an independent Armenia.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, as my colleagues were telling you last time, I mean, really, what they want to do is they want to see the dismantlement of the Armenian state. And by the way, there's also another interesting development that occurred recently, which was that Israel recognized the Armenian genocide, right? But this was purely, I want to emphasize, not this was not out of any sudden sense of compassion or anything like this. This was purely geopolitical,
Mhm.
in part given this idea of, I guess you could say the growing tension between Turkey and Israel. But I personally view it more as kind of theatrics, because at the end of the day, I mean, even though we see the Israelis increasingly being critical of Turkey, right? That nevertheless, Turkey is still has no problem, and Turkey for its part is also giving its tough rhetoric about Israel, but nevertheless, the oil is still flowing from Baku through Turkey to Israel. So it's business as usual as I see it. So I think it's more. There's a part of me that thinks this is more aimed toward the domestic Armenian consumption, and it may be also aimed at trying to bolster the TRIP project within Armenia. That's at least one of my theories. Because again, I mean, it's hard to kind of make out this whole, so-called tension between Turkey and Israel, when at the end of the day, I mean, Turkey is a member of NATO. It's within the same kind of defense sphere and structure as Israel. It's still the oil is flowing, as I said. So there are very legitimate questions to be asked about that.
True. However, like Turkey is as in my view historically, like always or most of the time, actually playing on everybody's
Yeah,
wedding or
absolutely,
dancing on
absolutely,
everybody's wedding.
absolutely.
And Turkey is on the EU naughty list, right? There was
Yeah,
just a post a couple of days ago of the EU scolding Turkey. I mean,
absolutely.
you are on the accession list, but you're not fulfilling the all of the checklist, right? And there's strict rules in order to adhere to EU standards if you want to join. By the way, these rules do not apply to Ukraine, and we are very angry with Poland that they're standing in the way of loosening all of these rules for Ukraine. Very very angry, but for you, the rules, the red card.
But here's the funny thing about that. They still say about the rules, the red card and all that. But the EU also, they're the ones who wants, this kind of middle corridor, right? They want to
Yeah,
get access to that. And because, right now they're paying, a fortune for the LNG, right? Because they shot themselves in the foot over Russia, which they're
yeah,
still
but
very hysterical about. And so the idea is that if we can get that alternative energy from Azerbaijan through Turkey, maybe even going all the way to Central Asia, that would be, a fantastic thing. So at one point they're scolding Turkey, right? They're saying you're so naughty, we're going to give you the red card and all this and that, but they're still doing business with them. So there's a kind of a weird kind of like, back and forth, weird
so
kind of dance, that you see with this.
you know what infuriates me the most is not even the duplicity of the speech. It's that it just seems downright dumb, as in self-defeating. But then again, I mean, if you put it that way and you say like, yeah, red card, but still trading, maybe I should lower that a little bit and say like, okay, they're still being like cold-blooded realists in the sense that they still try to extract whatever they can. But then again, it's still
Well,
self-defeating to do this kind of
what
stuff.
they're trying to do, Pascal, is they're trying to like try and you know walk the tightrope between realism and between liberal interventionism. They want both. I
Mhm.
guess maybe that they want both. We go back to IR theory that's what they want. They want to be both liberals and realists at the same time. And I it's just, but I think actually it speaks more to the chaos of the current moment we're in internationally. But we shall see how all that develops. I think that though it is quite interesting that even Pashinyan did not welcome Israel's recognition of the genocide. I thought that was really really quite notable. But nevertheless, I mean, most because he was saying that Israel should not weaponize the genocide and all this and that. But even still, most Armenians, they don't like they're not big fans of Israel or Pashinyan. And in addition, the other issue at play here is because Israel is now actively engaged in its own genocide, how does that give any weight to them, finally coming to terms, recognizing the Armenian genocide,
No, I mean,
yeah,
sorry, like
it's
asking Israel not to weaponize a genocide is like asking a fish to not swim. It's like,
absolutely.
good luck with that. Um, but like, let's go away from the polemics and maybe move even a little bit further, because like, if we then go all the way to Russia at the moment, there is all of this chatter in my part of the internet that I call the commentariat, about what Russia is doing, right? On the one hand, they've been hammered by drones and a couple of missiles the last couple of months, and we've seen these huge smoke plumes over St. Petersburg, even Moscow, apartments being attacked, and these Western-made, European-made weapons then assembled in Ukraine and fired at the Russians, really trying to cause also, cause panic inside Russia. On the other hand, Russia is firing back at Ukraine. I mean, massive strikes also on Kiev, but it is threatening to target Europe, but it's obviously not doing it. So how are you making sense of that situation? Because question is, what is the Russian strategy to deal with what, in my view, is like the NATO salami slicing of the war into mainland Russia, which it's not new. It's not new, but just
No.
the drone and missile scale of the last couple of months, that is kind of a new phase to me.
Well, I think that when we look, Pascal, at the situation right now with the war, and we look at the situation right now with Russia itself, of course, first of all, what we should understand is the war is running at Russia's pace, right? There is this idea that maybe this war of attrition it's such as it is a war of attrition, because Ukraine is being so fantastic on the battlefield, and it's showing the Russians what for or what not. But really, Russia is, and it makes sense too, because Russia is the larger country here. That they're the ones who are advancing slowly but steadily, right? Now, the decision to run the war at this pace has caused some frustration in Russia, in part because, again, we see that Ukraine, because it's desperate, it doesn't know what else to do. It's not winning the conventional war, that it's resulted in them turning toward basically these kind of drone attacks or terrorist attacks against various Russian cities. One of them being St. Petersburg, as you mentioned. But if there is frustration within Russia that the war is moving too slowly, and I had actually been in St. Petersburg in May, and it was interesting to me to see that people were rather war wary. And in addition to everything else, there was also some frustration about the access to Telegram, right? That, again, and Russia, again, is doing this because of its, own security concerns vis-a-vis Ukraine and all that. But still, Telegram is the most widely used messenger in Russia. So you have people who would never have even used a VPN before, now all of a sudden using a VPN. uh, you know, Nevertheless, people are not blaming the government. I don't see there being a palace coup against Putin or anything like this. And they are still the man on the street is still blaming the government in Kiev for what is going on. Now, recently in the war itself, Russia has actually taken Konstantinovka, right? That was the big victory for them. And that means they're almost getting ready to take the rest of Donbass, because after this is Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And way back in the day, I can tell you, in 2014, in the first Donbass war, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk were two major cities, right? In the end, Ukraine won control over those cities, and they fortified them for close to a decade now. And they're really the last fortresses Ukraine has in Donbass. And this is really, a scary thing for Ukraine, because once Russia takes these fortified industrial cities, what else does Ukraine have to fall back on? And that kind of opens up, Russia to do a much more dramatic advance to the west, to the Dnieper River, let's say, to Kiev itself. And so this actually makes the situation much more alarming for Ukraine. So Ukraine, which is also facing massive manpower shortages, is throwing everything it can at Russia in terms of these drone attacks, in terms of, trying to prick, the Russians, and also trying to, create popular discontent against Moscow, against the government. And it's not, I think that at the end of the day, even though there is war wariness in Russia, you can definitely feel that when you're there. Um, at the end of the day, the tide of the war is turning against Zelensky. Now, that being said, most Russians, there's a lot of frustration with what they're hearing from Europe, from these European politicians, right? That we want to, that we need to, confront Russia and all this and that. But at the end of the day, when you talk to real experts about this, I mean, you have to think what are the defense capabilities of the Europeans fighting alone? It's not substantial, right? And that's the thing, that the big question now has been, especially when we talk about alternative media, there's been a lot of talk about, the Karaganov scenario, that, Sergei Karaganov famously is talking about this idea that, what if the Russians were to, do a nuclear attack, or do even a conventional attack on one of the Western European countries, to send a message to show that, we still mean business, to kind of reinforce or revive that idea of a nuclear deterrent, that the belief is that the West has ceased to be afraid of us. They've ceased to understand the gravity of the nuclear deterrent. But at the end of the day, I don't believe most Russians have an appetite for expanding this war to Western Europe, and they're more focused on, a conventional defeat over Ukraine. So that's why, I mean, there is that kind of more hawkish rhetoric you're hearing in Russia, and it should be very concerning for the Europeans. But I don't think, and also the European people, I can say this, Pascal, and of course, I mean, you're Swiss, so you would be able to identify this with this. But my sense is that the European people are tired of the elites, and they're not, buying this kind of war rhetoric, even though it's permeated the media. It's permeated the official discussion, the officially sanctioned discussion.
Yes, it has, and as quite often you also find within the general population this split, right? Uh, Somewhere around a normal distribution, about 30% are in line with the media narrative. About 30% are quite opposed to it, and about 40% in the middle are kind of, yeah, it's bad, but Russia is evil. We shouldn't go to war, but I really hope Putin dies soon. Like kind of stuff like this, right?
Yeah.
But anyhow, it's kind of a normal distribution. I would say it's not rabid kind of massive popular Russophobia over there.
No, no,
But
no.
the interesting and the most interesting interpretation I've heard of this recently came from Vladimir Brovkin, who was saying basically Russia's combining two strategic elements. One is keep what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So actually, use this moment to learn how to intercept these drones and missiles and so on. And actually, we see a decrease of the impact that they have, even though the number of the things increases. So Russia is making technological and military progress in dealing with this stuff that's coming their way. On the other hand, hide your strength, bide your time, because the more time Russia has to still build up with this massive manufacturing that they have going, the more arsenal they're getting in the background, including Oreshniks and whatnot. And their military is still growing. So, they are just becoming a bigger and bigger bear. And at some point, it's a little bit like the Chihuahua that is yelling and barking at the big bulldog or the big bear through the glass window, right? And once the glass window is being removed, the Chihuahua will actually understand what's happening. And in a sense, like maybe they're waiting for that, and that's also what they're working with the Americans. At some point that glass window might go away, and well, then they will. The Chihuahuas will have a serious problem. But I don't know how you see that kind of.
Well, I think that the one way you do that is, I mean, you kind of undermine the whole narrative that, well, the Russians, because in the West, there's this idea that, well, there's this war of attrition in Ukraine because, the Russians, that they just can't do it, right? They're not strong enough. They can't push ahead, right? There's this kind of a skepticism that this is the Russian strategy on purpose,
Yeah,
to
exactly.
attrit.
on purpose to pretend or if the Europeans want to believe that you're so weak, let them believe it, because it's actually going to help the Russians to build up their strength even more.
Absolutely, and versus the Europeans who are not ready for a war. But once Russia, like, let's say, if it gets to, I mean, when we're talking about the future, and of course it's difficult to predict, what's exactly going to happen. But if we end up with a situation where Russia is just cutting across Ukraine like a hot knife on butter, then the Europeans, it's gonna be a wake up call for them. They're gonna actually see what really is the reality here. This is not a paper tiger like they've convinced themselves it is. That this is a real, this is a superpower. And my God, I mean, God forbid if we actually confront them with nuclear weapons or something like that. The other thing, again, like I bring up to you is this point, and again, it's just amazing how some countries don't look at other theaters in the world where that, the Baltic states, for example, they think that, well, if we have NATO here and we have the protection of NATO, and also this goes for Finland too and Sweden, that it's going to prevent any kind of a Russian attack or any kind of situation, negative consequence for us. But look at what happened with the GCC states in the Persian Gulf. Look at what happened with them when they had all those wonderful American military installations and how Iran attacked them. And that's a lesson going back to to the Baltic republics. That's something that they should be taking away from that. But I don't see that, unfortunately. I don't see that rational, thinking,
No.
especially in what I think is most remarkable, Pascal, is Finland. Again, we go back to that discussion. I think we had it a few years ago where I was saying, why would that neutrality, and you would definitely agree with this, is one of the greatest guarantors of enhancing your political independence. And I was just utterly stunned that Finland would just give that up. It was such a great card to have, this neutrality, and to become basically, one of these kind of, anti or Russophobic states, or one of these states that is, pushing for war on the fringes of Europe. I think it's a disservice to them. I mean, they're putting themselves in the position of let's say Qatar in the Persian Gulf.
No, absolutely. I mean, on the first point with the Baltic states, you use that expressions. You hope that they get the memo. The problem with the Europeans and the Baltics, part of that, is that they usually get the memo handed by historians 50 years after the fact.
Absolutely, and frankly, Pascal, is a great tragedy for Europe, because again, as I talked about on this program, there's a whole history of war in Europe. And that's not something that, I mean, I would think that Europeans are ignorant of. I mean, certainly they read history. They know their histories. They know the history of the 100 Years' War. They know the history of the wars of religion. They know the histories of World War I, World War II. But it's just, and it's interesting because it seemed like as if from the EU that they had learned those lessons, and now they're.
I mean, it's
not, yeah.
That's the problem with the black box. It's not the problem that nobody inside the black box knows it. It's the wrong people. I mean, we're literally talking about Kaya Kallas, who said on TV that it is news to her that the Soviets won the Second World War. Because some of these people, especially the ones in the office right now, are just so incredibly ignorant that it's hard to wrap our minds around it. But then, and the same seems to be going on in states that used to be cold-blooded realists, like the Finns. I mean, there's this beautiful book. I actually have it right here in front of my screen, like Neutrality, the Finnish Position, a collection of essays by Urho Kekkonen. Kekkonen, the great Finnish statesman, right? A long-term president and leader, right? And he understood precisely that Finnish neutrality had to protect the northwestern flank of the Soviet Union. And as long as it did that, as it served as the buffer to the northwestern flank, Finland would be left alone and would be fine. And it was fine. It wasn't forced into the Warsaw Pact because it fulfilled its security role to the Soviets, and they understood that. And today, the Finnish leadership doesn't. They don't.
No, they don't. I mean, I seriously question the Finnish leadership's, fidelity to protecting its own people. It's putting its own people in danger. And not only that, you have to think that going back into the history, they should know, the cost of war with Russia. Certainly, we go back to the Winter War, the continuation war. That's not something that they benefited so much with by having good trade relations with Russia, by having good economic relations with Russia. Like I said, people in St. Petersburg, they felt betrayed when they learned the news that Finland, basically became decided to ditch its neutrality and became a member of NATO. They felt as if it was a personal betrayal. Moreover, what's interesting, Pascal, is how this term, Finlandization, became a pejorative term in the West. And it was done in that way, I'll tell you, on purpose, because the people in the military-industrial complex, the people in the defense industries in the West, particularly in the United States, who, come hell or high water, wanted to, confront the Russians, those dastardly commies, that at the end of the day, they were trying to seed it into the minds of people that neutrality is bad. You don't want neutrality. That maybe we could flip Finland and turn it into a bulwark against, the Russians. It was even during the Cuban Missile Crisis that even the JFK, I think he told Anastas Mikoyan famously, yes, how would the Soviets feel? How would the people of Leningrad feel if Finland joined NATO? As if he could, kind of command the Finns to do that. And Mikoyan said, well, the people in Leningrad would sleep just as soundly as the people in Armenia, because we have this issue with Turkey and the missiles there. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is being, discussed. But nevertheless, that always was quite striking to me, that you had this kind of war lobby that wanted to seed into the public domain this idea that Finlandization, that neutrality was something negative. It was something to be ashamed of. That it's good to have war. Don't you understand? It's good. We profit so much. We profit so much. How can they lose those profits?
That's the thing to understand. There's a lot of people in the West, especially not especially, the number one is, of course, the neocon circles, and you have European neocons as well, and they want to use war as a means to get what they really desire, which is total dominance. And in that kind of worldview, neutrality is just as bad as the other one is. It may be even worse because it undermines your position. So you need to switch off the neutrality of Georgia. You need to switch off the one of Ukraine. And they successfully switched it off, right? And transformed it from a buffer state that kept the peace into a battering ram that offered them the war that they wanted, right? And the same they do with the Finns and the others. And this is very interesting. Also, this trash talking of neutrality in order to make it a dirty word is Finlandization. There is only one of several examples. The other fascinating example is the rebranding of 150 years of U.S. neutrality into isolationism.
Yeah,
nobody before the 1940, before 45, looked at it as isolationism. Everybody who was for the policy called it neutrality, which it was. That's why the greatest neutrality scholars of the 20th century are actually all Americans, because they were working on that very, very strongly. So it's fascinating,
Yeah, and actually goes back, like, that position, Pascal, goes all the way back to the founding fathers. They didn't want the United States to be involved in these foreign entanglements. They wanted to build a republic here.
That's why George Washington proclaimed in 1793 American neutrality toward the Europeans, not toward the rest, but toward the Europeans.
Absolutely, absolutely. But also, speaking of the United States, the other thing I want to mention is how now, Trump was trying to kind of put this position very early on in his administration that, Ukraine, I can solve this within 24 hours, right? And in the end, it must be a pretty long 24 hours, because we're still here and we're still waiting for that peace to come. But the reality is that the mask kind of fell when Marco Rubio made the statement that, well, we really aren't neutral brokers in this. And that, we're still kind of favoring one side. We're still kind of, giving the weapons to Ukraine, but still kind of hope that they win, at the end of the day. So the question is, where does this, I guess you could say, spirit of anchorage, where does this stand now? It's a big question to ask. And I think the Russians feel as if that was all completely a fake, that they were trumped. That Trump. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like that whole documentary about the golf course in Scotland. They called You've Been Trumped. Well, this is a similar thing. They were trumped. The Russians were trumped, and so now they have to figure out what they're going to do. And I think that they've decided that, we can't trust anything that this guy says. He's a congenital liar. He just, spouts off whatever he feels. He tweets out whatever he feels on Truth Social. And actually, by the way, Americans, especially now, because a lot of people are in reflection in the United States now because it's the 250th anniversary of America, and they're thinking about how in the Sam Hill did we get here, where we have such a president as Trump? How do we go from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Donald Trump? And Joe Biden, by the way, because he was also a disaster. How do we go from John Fitzgerald Kennedy to Trump? I mean, it baffles the mind, Pascal. How do we go from Abraham Lincoln to Trump, right? People are trying to figure this out, that, we aren't who we used to be. And Trump is the most visible, symbol of that. And I think, yeah. I mean,
Well,
what can you say?
Well, I mean, I have two kind of approaches to this. One is to say that maybe we're overestimating a little bit these historical figures, and if we put the magnifying glass on them, like maybe even somebody like George Washington wouldn't quite look as glorious as he done in retrospect.
Also, not only that, I mean, even with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I mean, you talk about the
Yeah.
internment of the Japanese and all that. I'm not, but I'm just like saying
No.
that's the popular mood in America.
No, but then on the other hand, you also have the pictures of each president, right? You can put them in a line and you can look at them and you can go like Roosevelt and JFK, and you can then go to uh, um, uh, Nixon, and it goes down, and then Clinton,
goes down and down.
Bush, and Clinton,
the turning
and
point
Bush
was-
again,
the
and
turning
Obama. And
point-
it's like,
the turning
hey,
point The turning point was the neoliberalization of the American economy, when America went away from Keynesianism. And the American dream, which actually had been expanding to include more and more people, it seemed, over time, right?
Yeah.
We would go from a country being founded by rich, white, landowning men, and eventually you had the freedom of the slaves. Eventually after that, by 1964, you have the civil rights, right? Eventually, you also had the right of women to vote, right? You eventually had working class people who they could eventually, the economy would create mobility so they could pull themselves up. But now with neoliberalism, we see an America that is more stratified by class than ever before, even more so than even the Gilded Age. The concentration of wealth is insane.
But Pietro, how can you say that? I mean, it was founded by rich, white, landowning men, and now the richest man in the United States is an African. I mean, isn't that a great program?
That's what they love to do. See, that's what they love to do. They love to do. I mean, just by changing the identity. If they put in, like, it's like if you put in at the top of a corporation a woman, a black, and a gay person, then suddenly the idea would be that now we are, that's progress. Now they're in the height of everything like that. And in reality, it doesn't change the fact that the corporation is predatory, exploitative, what have you. I mean, it doesn't. So now, if you just change the color of the person or change the face of the person, that doesn't change the problem.
But isn't that
much
cool?
deeper.
We've got richest man on earth is an African born man, and he's white. Isn't that convenient? Isn't that convenient? I mean, sorry. It's just the irony and the polemic writes itself about the current moment. That's the interesting thing. But maybe just one a last point about the United States. Do you think it will? Do you think it will ever get to the point where Trump will try to make good on what he said? Because you could also just call his presidency the one-day presidency, right? The 24 hours that never ended. But it seems to me that the Russians are still, I mean, despite everything, Vladimir Putin is still attaches some importance to this relationship with Donald Trump, which baffles quite a lot of people. How do you make sense?
It baffles a lot of people, but you also have to think, Pascal, it's necessary because still at the end of the day, they need that connection with Washington because let's be honest, there are three major superpowers. There are three superpowers in the world today: the United States, Russia, and China. And it's very, very, very important that the Russians still have a line of communication to the United States, no matter what they think about Trump. But also, what's fascinating is how on Independence Day, that it was Trump who called Putin. You would think that Putin or that the Russians would they maybe send some sort of congratulatory message to the
He
United
did. He
States
did.
or
He
something
sent a
like that.
letter. Yeah.
Yeah. But still, Trump called Putin, as I understand. It's quite interesting, and I wonder what they were discussing. I think officially it was about Ukraine, I believe, but I'm sure there were some Iran in there as well too. But who knows how it's all going to turn out? But that's the main thing, Pascal. You have to understand. Putin still wants to maintain this line of communication
Mm.
with Donald Trump. No matter what we think about Trump, that's the whole idea. Now, as for Trump, let's say finally realizing his campaign promises or whatnot, I don't see it. I think that Trump, in terms of, I think he's obliged to, being part of the donor. I mean, he's obliged to his donors. And he is part of the swamp. There's this
Yeah.
whole phrase about Trump drain
Yeah.
the swamp. But I think really what the United States truly needs, Pascal, is its own form of glasnost and perestroika. And I was saying that going back to Obama's time. I mean, I was saying that maybe Obama is going to be the reformer that the United States needs. But that's really what I think is one positive you can take out of this Iran. I mean, from the American point of view, one positive you can take out of this Iran debacle is it hopefully will invite more introspection. That what we cannot be a million places at once. We have to, if you want to really promote democracy, as Jack Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, the last U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, famously said that if you want to promote democracy, show how it works at home. And right now, the United States is not,
Yeah.
showing how well it works at home. It's a big problem.
Yeah,
So,
I think you're right, but on the other hand, not on the other hand, on the other side, then from the side of Vladimir Putin, you can interpret what's going on as just his also entrenched no, not entrenched, but his firm grasp of realism, saying that yes, I know that the guy in the White House would kill me if he could. He probably tried once. He killed the Iranians, right? The Iranian leader. I know they kill me if he could, but I make sure that he can't, and I will maintain a line of communication with him, because what else is there to do? It's like
yeah,
can't make the Americans go away either. Therefore, you maintain a line of communication with those who would kill you if they had the power to do it, but so need to prevent their ability from doing so. So
absolutely.
well, that's the multipolar world.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's how, and I mean, de facto, I mean, that's the reality we live in. Even it's interesting because even if you listen to the American media, they still talk as if it's the unipolar moment, as if
Yeah.
we're still in 1992 or 1995 or something like that. And it's very clearly that it's very clear that de facto we are in the multipolar moment. The most vivid illustration being, of course, the whole Hormuz affair. And I don't see. I mean, I would think it would be utterly suicidal if the United States attempted to do an invasion of Iran from Iraq or something like that. By the way, one more thing. It Trump's threats toward Iran are rather alarming. We all know this. I mean, we've heard his threat. We know his famous threat to wipe out the civilization of Iran. The big question is, what would Russia or China do in a scenario such as this? Because if it gets to a point where we go into like a potential nuclear strike on Iran or something like that, God forbid, then where does that leave us? I think actually even North Korea recently made some remarks or declared a position that if Iran were to be attacked with a nuclear weapon, that North Korea would respond. But that it's a very serious matter. It's a very serious matter in
Yeah.
terms of what would be the response if there was a nuclear strike on Iran. And maybe that's one of the things that Trump and Putin, could talk about with Xi, ideally, to kind of regulate this. Because, when Trump just just decides to make some crazy, threat, like I'm going to wipe out the entire civilization of Iran, and then he's also kind of, posting or retweeting a video of by this Levine, who is basically this American neocon commentator who's saying maybe it would be a good idea to do a nuclear attack on Iran because we had to do that with the Japanese. This is the argument he has. It's not my argument, but that's what he's saying.
No.
It really raises some serious concerns. So that's something also the Russians and the Chinese need to consider.
Yeah, and you might be right on the money, as John Mearsheimer usually says, that maybe this is what the Russians are rather working on, on the very highest level, to say, like, instead of trying to solve the nitty-gritty in the Donbass, which our military is already working on, let's try to get to a point where we can revive the most important kind of missile treaties, the nuclear weapons treaties that we used to have, and that are gone. But let's work on something like that, a nuclear protocol or something, and maybe something like that is part of this kind of high level discussions and aspirations of Vladimir Putin. That would make sense to me, looking at how they went about things before.
And one thing I just also want to say too, I mean, it's utter folly to think that the Europeans can stop the Russian steamroller in Ukraine. I mean, it's moving slowly, but
Yeah, but
still.
it's
So I
very
mean, they when you take Konstantinovka,
yeah.
then it's just a matter of time before they get to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. And these cities, I mean, like, again, I can go all the way back to 2014. I was watching the 2014 war very closely at the time. I was in communication with my former mentor, Stephen F. Cohen, one of the veteran Russia, scholars. And we were watching what was going down in Ukraine at the time. Slavyansk was always in the news. He would do these podcasts with John Batchelor, where he'd always be talking about, the battle over Slavyansk. And that's not a light thing if the Russians take these very, heavy, fortified cities. And so that's what we're looking at in the coming weeks and months.
Yes, we are. And we already passed the hour by quite a couple of minutes. So, Pietro, people who want to follow you, where should they go?
Well, I usually write for the American Committee of East-West Accord, formerly known as the American Committee for, actually, no, excuse me. I write for the American Committee of U.S.-Russia Accord, which is also the American Committee for, it used to be East-West Accord. And I am also occasional contributor to James Carden's The Realist Review, so you can find me there. Also, I've written a book, Anastas Mikoyan, an Armenian reformer in Khrushchev's Kremlin. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. And I don't have my own Substack, unfortunately. I mean, I've a lot going on right now in my life. So, but yeah.
I'll put a link to the sites that you just mentioned into the description box below. Pietro Shakarian, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal.